You're listening to the Table Talk podcast, brought to you by Food Matters Live.
Welcome to the Table Talk podcast. I'm Stefan Gates. I'm a writer and broadcaster specialising in food and science. Now, we're here recording on location at Food Matters Live at XL, and this podcast is all about feeding the world. Here in the studio, we have Tony Hunter, who's a food futurist, and he's just finished a summit session, and we want to look at how we can feed the world's population sustainably and equitably. Now, I'm interested in advances in food technology that has the potential to solve this crisis, but also what needs to happen for these to be mainstream, both from policy and from society. So, Tony, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and all your listeners.
Yeah. Can you start off by just mapping out the scale of the problem of feeding the world and the challenges that we face?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as we know, there's about 7.7 billion people on the planet at the moment, and we have there's going to be 10 billion by 2050. But if you look back 50 years ago, there were only 3.5 billion people on the planet. Now, that means that within the lifespan of a single generation, we have virtually exceeded the planetary ability to support humanity. So that's a single lifespan. And that just gives you an idea of the order of magnitude of the problem, because 50 years ago, a lot of people still around, and they're going to see by the end of their lifespan, in 2050, let's say, we'd nearly triple the population, 2.5 times at least. And we have the same planet. It's the old one, there is no planet B. We have a finite amount of resources, and how we use that sustainably and equitably, and getting those two things right, because they are in tension, is really going to be the major challenge that we're going to face between now and 2050.
Now, year on year, agricultural production does increase. It sort of has pretty much, I don't know if it's every single year, but certainly there are ongoing agricultural revolutions, and we produce more every year. Are we producing enough food currently? And are you saying that there is a maximum capacity of people on the planet that we can feed at some point? And will we stop being able to increase capacity?
Well, if you look at it this way, if everybody in the world today were to eat the way we do in the UK, the way we're eating here at the summit, and the way they do in Australia and the US, there is physically not enough land on the planet to grow the food we need. So, not enough land on the planet. Full stop. We use 50% of the arable land on the planet currently for agriculture. 70% of that's used in some way, shape or form for livestock. And, if we were to try and feed the world the way that we all eat now, we'd have to basically deforest the entire planet. And we know how bad things are at the moment. Imagine the catastrophic effects of pretty well deforesting the planet to feed everybody now and up to 2050.
Now, we often talk about this subject, and we talk about there's going to be 9 billion people in a certain date and things like that. And I think people get a little bit. It's not bored, but they become a little bit numb to the concept, and they go to the shops, and food pretty much stays the same price. I mean, food prices are rising. How do we kick people up the bum? I mean, what's needed to make people say, no, this is a problem that needs to be tackled?
Most of this stuff, it's what's in it for me. And at the moment, what's in it for me doesn't exist. What's in it for me to do something about how much I eat? Yeah, well, maybe obesity, but we've been at that for decades. I mean, just telling people to eat less, to eat differently. And we had Alan this morning talking about the composition of the diet of people in the UK, and virtually no one's eating the Eat Well diet. So how do you make people do that? That's very interesting. Do you use punitive taxes, sugar taxes? Do you triple the price of chocolate so people can't afford it because people eat too much chocolate? What do you do? I think there's a whole raft of policy changes that can be made. But that really only addresses the problem as far as those of us who have already got more than enough to eat anyway. And the World Resources Institute put out a study recently, a report saying that basically what we need to do is to get people who eat too much to eat less. And I go, yeah, right, good luck with that one. We've been telling people about obesity and type 2 diabetes for decades. Look how well that's worked. What I say is, if we want to equitably feed people, telling people in developed countries to eat less ain't going to work. But what you do is you democratise and you the means of production. So, in other words, if you look at simply saying we're going to take the food that we don't eat in the UK or Australia where it's produced and send it to Africa, I don't see that working very well. And if we want to do this equitably, I'm saying put the means of production in those countries. There's new technologies now that don't need arable land. There's a company, and we've got the Parsi here from Solar Foods. They can take non-arable land, solar energy, break water down into hydrogen and oxygen, add some minerals and a bit of CO2, and they can grow biomass. That can be texturised to make alternative meat products or ingredients for food, and that doesn't require arable land. You need lots of sunlight, and non-arable land, a small amount of water. It's about 100 times to 1,000 times better in terms of water consumption, because water's another major problem that we've got. So you can set up entire economies, entire ecology food systems that don't rely on growing crops and animals the way that we do now. So I think that is the really positive side of what we can do with these technologies. Because I say to people think of these new things as food companies. They're not. They're technology companies that make food. Think of it like our smartphones. 13 years ago, smartphones didn't exist. Now look at what we can do now compared to what we could do before smartphones existed. Now, we're in the well pre-smartphone phase of some of these new technologies. Imagine 10, 15, 20 years of these new technologies. What they're going to be capable of is just mind-blowing. The possibilities are endless. And I don't think there's going to be a single part of the food industry that's not going to be affected by one or more of these technologies. And the big one is very horribly named, no marketing guide did this, the academics did it, synthetic biology. I mean, you want a product that was made by synthetic biology? Probably not. But it is capable of doing wonderful things. And for instance, just what it's already doing, if you know someone with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, they probably take insulin, right? Mm-hmm. Now, where does insulin come from? It used to come from trainloads of pig pancreases, tons and tons to make grams of insulin. And it was from pigs, which are close to humans, but still not perfect. Then a company called Genentech, back in the 80s, had the idea of we'll put human insulin gene into a microbe and get it to make insulin. A company called Eli Lilly commercialised that in 1982. So for the last, 37 years, people have been injecting the product of a genetically modified organism into their body. So synthetic biology has been around a long time. Same thing with rennet. Rennet's used to make cheese. And you put the rennet in, it separates out into the curds and whey, you get the curds, you squeeze them up and you make cheese out of them, right? Very simple, I know, but a little bit more complicated than that. But the rennet that's used to make that is made through genetically engineered organisms. We've been eating the product manufactured using genetically modified organisms. So synthetic biology has been around a long time, and you can make all sorts of things. There's a company called Perfect Day in the US. They're making whey protein using synthetic biology, so non-animal whey protein. Now, we're talking about doubling the consumption of whey protein in the world in the next 10 years. Animal agriculture either can't keep up, or if it did, would go back to where we're talking about deforesting vast areas of the planet to graze more cows, to make more milk, to extract 1 or 2% of what we want in terms of whey. Now, Perfect Day are making that product now, and they've teamed up with a company called ADM, who are a $62 billion US company, to commercialise the product. Because one of the problems you've got with these new technologies, how do you go from making a few kilos or a few hundred kilos or a few tonnes to making thousands of tonnes, tens of thousands of tonnes on a routine basis? And that's where a lot of these new technologies, these companies teaming up with large, well-established companies who see the future, who has a vision out ahead 10, 20, 30 years out of what could happen, and they're in the business of making money and perhaps possibly helping make that happen, if they can make some money out of it. And if you've got 62 billion and you drop 10, 20, 30 million dollars, it's not going to send you broke, is it? It's in the last few decimal places. So these guys are, in essence, taking out insurance policies on some of these technologies, and they have what scale-ups need. Scale-ups generally don't understand business. They're not business people. They don't have marketing. They don't have distribution. They don't have production experience. You team up with someone like ADM, they've got everything you need. They're experts in the field. They have distribution, marketing muscle and everything else. Then you're saying to yourself, that product really has a future, and it should be out in 2021. So
now before we talk about the tricky aspect of implementation, which is obviously the secondary bit, this is the exciting meat of this interview with you, because you're a specialist in agri-food tech.
Yep.
Just give us, I know that it's skimming the surface, but just give us what are the 3 or 4 most exciting developments that you think have cropped up in the agritech food space?
Yeah. Well, first one is one we've talked about, synthetic biology. There's nothing that will not be changed by synthetic biology. The second one is what we probably listeners will have heard about, which is the cell-based. Cultivated meat is the latest one. Hate lab-based. I hate pictures of Petri dishes full of minced meat, test tubes full of minced meat. I mean, all new food products start in a lab. The new flavour of your yogurt started in a food lab somewhere, right?
It's because they want to be able to say the phrase Frankenstein food.
Frankenfoods.
Yeah.
I say to the conventional industry, be careful what you wish for. I will, any day of the week, take them describing cultivated meat in the worst way they can, and I'll show people a picture of what happens to Daisy between the farm gate and the plastic wrapped steak, and let's see which one they want to try.
Let's get back to your exciting development.
And the other one is alternative proteins. Why? What is magical about getting your protein from animals or plants? It's simply because that's what we're accustomed to, and that's what we've managed to scale enormously. But you look at these new technologies, I talked about one this morning from a company called Arbiome. They can take wood and turn it into biomass and protein that can be textured to make various food products. So that's taking all, you can use the shavings, you can use the sawdust, you can use the wood that would normally burn that helps contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and turn it into food. So there's a great technology for using waste product and turning it into human edible product and doing the most that you can with the products that you've currently got. Then we've got the other one, which is Solar Foods, and Solar Foods, a Finnish company. Pasi is here today as well. And what they do is they basically take sunlight, solar energy, split water into hydrogen and oxygen, add some microbes into that with a few other nutrients, and turn that into biomass. There's protein again. So there are lots of new technologies that could go on for ages about all the different ones that are around that will enable us to get the protein that we need without relying on having to simply scale further what is basically unsustainable to try and bring everybody on the planet up to an equitable distribution of food.
So I've just finished a TV series where I interviewed lots of fishermen and lots of farmers, and obviously you get to the farm and the farmers, they're absolutely wonderful people. They're generally, they're on the breadline. I mean, they really are. Yeah. They're not. They tend to be breaking even with the farm, and the profit they make is actually the subsidy, and that's what and it's a pretty sort of thin profit line. And they say, look, what I'm doing here is I'm doing something for my customers, and I'm putting my life into it. And they pour scorn on new industries by saying, well, it's not real, it's not, these are fake foods. I mean, there's a dialogue there that needs to happen, isn't there? You can't just wipe out an industry, and I don't think we ever will. How does new agritech butt up against old-fashioned traditional farming?
Look, I think you're right there. New technologies have always been demonised, or they've been called Franken products. Give you an example. Do you go to your fridge and say, I'm going to take out my mechanically frozen ice out of the fridge, the freezer? Of course you don't. You just go and take ice. But back in the 1800s, there were ice barons who made fortunes shipping ice from the lakes of North America to India. Even with it melting, they could still make their fortune, because once you had ice in your orange juice in India, you weren't going to go back. You give it to you for free. Get the old one, do it with
First one's free.
Another type of ice, but give you them free, and then you're hooked, right? So that was unnatural. Natural ice melted slower than this unnatural ice. So there's always going to be that tension where people don't understand new technologies, and one of the reactions to that is to demonise this new technology. But we don't go and get our mechanically frozen ice. I'm popping down the garage, dear, I'm just going to get some of that mechanically frozen ice. It's just ice, isn't it? I mean, ice is ice, just made in a different way. I hate to think what died in the lake that they got the ice from, so I don't know where they thought that was better.
Well, also in traditional farming, at some point somebody invented the plough and the seed drill and all of these huge advances, and that put lots of people out of work, and it changed, but it did also increase production of land. So the farmers themselves have benefited from advances as well. Okay, now what are the challenges with implementing new technology, new agritech? I mean, first of all, you talked about money, basically.
Yep.
People need a lot of funding. But what else is there? Is there sort of legislation, regulation, resistance from traditional farming communities?
Yeah, look, I think you've got several things. You've got the conventional agriculture industries, which are now very well organised. Everywhere you go in the world, conventional agriculture is well organised, well mobilised. And unfortunately, one of the first things that people go to, often for new technologies, is legislation. So let's see if we can legislate this out of existence. Look how well that worked for the music industry. Why does Spotify, a small Swedish company, own the music stream industry and not Sony Music or one of the big music companies in the UK? They don't. They tried legislation, they tried prosecuting their own customers for downloading MP3s, and they found out that the people who downloaded the most MP3s actually bought the most music. They were just addicted to it and they wanted more. So they were actually prosecuting their biggest customers. So there's that side of things. Then that of course, leads on to the legislation, where you have pressure groups wanting legislation put on to protect their livelihood. And you can say, as you pointed out, Stefan, you can well understand people wanting to protect their livelihood, but using legislation to stifle technology is not going to work.
Can you just give us an example of what you're talking about, just to put it in context?
Yeah, well, if you have a look, I mean, the obvious one is particularly in the US and happening around the world is trying to corral the use of the term burger or the term steak. And then you've got the milk as well. But the one that enraged me personally the most when I found out these things is, because we consumers are easy to fool, is, did you know there is no butter in peanut butter? I was enraged. I thought if it had the word butter, it meant it was dairy, didn't it? So I'm personally enraged about that whole thing. But really, these things are about a form factor. It's a physical. A burger is a physical thing, whatever it's made of. A steak is a physical thing. We have ham steaks. We have coconut meat, coconut milk, been around for a long, long time. And trying to corral these terms is an artificial way, to me, of trying to stifle the innovation and the competition that we're seeing. And that if we don't open up these terms to other alternative technologies, we leave the consumer not knowing what to do. If I put a product out in front of the consumer and say, do you want to buy that? First thing in their mind is, what do I use it for? I can't tell you. I can't give you any frame of reference for it. Do you want to buy it? No. Okay, here's the thing. It's a burger. It's not made from meat. It's made from other stuff, and it's called a burger. Oh, good. I can barbecue it. I can make it. Mentally, you've got an anchor point of knowing what that can be used for. Removing that anchor point, can be quite a powerful weapon. I think for the plant-based milk industry, the cow was long bolted, and even if you took the word milk off every single alternative milk product on the market, people would still buy it now because they know what it's used for. I put it in my coffee. Of course I do. There it is. It's called whatever. It doesn't say milk on it anymore. Yeah, but I know what I use it for. And that's what's going to happen. People know what these things are used for, and they will be able to use it anyway. So, it is difficult when technologies change, which leave people potentially losing their livelihoods. It is a fact of history. I mean, imagine if we today were still riding horses. Would we protect the blacksmiths, the people who make the saddles and everything else? where do you draw the line between reasonable compensation to people, because we don't just want to throw people out into the street. No way do we want to do that. But how do we manage the transition? Because I think there's going to be a transition, whether it's 10%, 50% or 100% of our agriculture ends up disappearing, there's going to be a transition. And that's going to be in the hands of all the parties that are involved to make sure that transition happens in an orderly way, and that, for the sake of the whole population, local and global, that we get the best out of these new technologies, because we're going to need them. So we just simply cannot feed the planet with the current food and agricultural system. It's just simply not going to happen.
And part of your talk was how can we feed the world's population equitably? How does that? What do you mean by that, and how does that work?
Well, when I say equitably, I think it means if you go back to what is a basic diet that people need to be healthy, how many calories do they need? So that you've got that equitable distribution where we don't have, as we have now, I think the last one was about 820 odd million people malnourished. Now, how can we do that with all the food that's around? Well, we could probably get them almost enough, but even redistributing the food is probably not going to do it. So the thing I mentioned before is if we equitably distribute the means of production, in other words, people can have their own food system that doesn't rely on the fact that another country has the arable land, that they own the means of production, and that country has to buy it, import it, and is at the vagaries of things even like exchange rates, the climate. We know we've got climate change. So how do we do that? And I think that equitably distributing food is about equitably distributing the means of food, making food. I mean, it is that old cliche, but cliches always have a nugget of truth. Give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, feed him for life.
Well, it's the classic concept about aid. So in places like I visited Haiti and spoke to lots of rice farmers there. And now Haiti is a huge market for subsidised American rice. It's not aid, it's not given, but it's hugely subsidised, so it's dirt cheap. And the Americans say, here we are, our largesse is boundless, we give you this cheap rice. And the Haitian farmers go, well, who's going to buy my rice? So they can't afford to plant their own rice fields because nobody's going to buy it because this American rice is dirt cheap. So that what's perceived as, although I think frankly there's another problem going on here really. What's perceived as a gift is actually incredibly destructive. And emergency aid when people are starving it makes sense, but systemic aid actually seems to cause more problems than it solves. Is that the case?
I would definitely agree with that. I mean, basically, you're tying that market economically, that country economically to you. And they know which side their rice is buttered on, mix my metaphors. And, if it goes wrong, well, then the population are going to rise up. We've seen food riots overthrow governments in the last few years already. And obviously, you'd be at the mercy of whoever was supplying you that largesse out of the goodness of their heart.
So how do we get the means of production to countries where possibly they can't afford it?
So I think that's interesting in that really what's needed once you've got the technology is the means of scaling and the means of getting it to that marketplace. If you look at the amount of VC money, venture capital money and other money that's going into food technology and food products, somebody dropping a few $100 million to set up a plant in Nigeria to start an industry to feed that country is eminently doable. And when you look at the fact that in 2050, Nigeria will have more people than the US, they're not going to be as rich. The economy is not going to be as big. 423 million people in Nigeria in 2050. Now, if you're a venture capitalist and you're a food company and you can set up a food system in Nigeria with a consumer population of 423 million, wouldn't you go ahead and do it?
Get down the bank, Tony. What are you doing here?
Let me just get the credit card out here. Let me say, damn it, there's a few zeros missing off the end, Stefan. It's just not going to happen.
So do you think this is happening, that we probably wouldn't know if it was?
I don't think it's happening now because a lot of these new technologies are in the scale-up. So as you know, when you look at an exponential curve, the first part looks like a straight line, but it's a very shallow curve. And people think linearly. They think if it took 5 years to get to here, to get to twice here will take another 5 years. If you're near the inflection point, that 5 years development could take 2 years. That 2 years plus 5 is 7. We'll take 1 year. And so we're seeing that now. And what we need to do, of course, is get the scale up. And scaling it up when it's still going to be expensive at first in an underdeveloped country in Africa is not going to work. But if you can set that up in a developed country where the market will bear some of the costs of that, and then once you've got the scale, you can then transfer that to some of the other countries, then I think that's a far better way than trying to say, we've got to get people to eat less. I just say simply don't see it happening.
Mm. And what are those sort of exportable technologies? Are we talking robotic farming? Are we talking GM crops?
Ooh.
What do you think the low-hanging fruit is there?
Look, I think you're looking at two different things. If you're looking at countries who have sufficient arable land, then certainly genetically modified crops, optimising their farming systems, that's going to show some low-hanging fruit, some early gains. If you're talking about countries fundamentally don't have enough arable land, you're looking at new state-of-the-art cutting-edge technologies that can come in where there is no arable land and still produce food. I mean, for instance, if you want to grow algae outdoors, what do you need? You need a lot of land, it could be non-arable land. You need lots of sunlight with no rain, and if you're close to the water so you can pump in the seawater, even better. There's a lot of countries around the place that could use algae farms to produce products. That's still in the early stages now, but give us 5 years and that's going to be far more economically viable to produce protein, oils and other things from algae. So that sort of thing, technology can be exported to countries that don't have the arable land to actually grow their own food. Because I think that's the big problem. As climate change cuts in more and more, sub-Saharan Africa in particular is just going to get harder and harder to grow any food whatsoever using traditional agriculture. We've got to look at this non-traditional ways of making protein to get the food to those people. And brutally, if their choice is, there's a new product that I don't know much about, but it's eat that or starve, what are those people going to do? They're going to eat that product. And if it's done right and it is good for them, it's nutritious, it's safe and everything else, then those people will adopt that.
Okay, now what needs to be done to improve public awareness and the willingness to help to transform systems? I mean, how do we convince people that this really, the time is now?
Yeah, I think the thing is with these new technologies, it's familiarity. As we've talked a little bit about before, if you just suddenly dump something on someone, here you are, here's a new product on the market you've never heard of, maybe a technique you have no idea of, and don't worry about it, it's okay. I don't think that's going to work real well. But what we need is things like the Food Matters Summit, where people come together to discuss their technologies. They understand their technologies, they go back, they personally and through their companies, they explain what these products are, they make the product familiar. And the other analogy I use is IVF. Now, when that first came out, IVF, they were called test tube babies. But now, do we have two types of humans on the planet? IVF humans and natural humans? No, we just have human beings on the planet that just happen to be conceived in a different way. So that's the thing. Technology and bring that out, but if you get familiarity, then people... I've heard about that. I understand that. It was on the TV. Stefan did a whole show on that. And it looks really, really interesting. Wow, what a fantastic thing. It comes onto the market, something happens, people go, I remember seeing that. No, that doesn't look too bad. That looks interesting. But it means that, people, say, demonising their technology on the other side, that's the counter. Because without social licence from the consumer, it doesn't matter how good the product is. If people don't buy it, you're screwed. Right?
So would you say that the technology is there and ready to use, and it's just the dissemination of information to reduce the fear and ignorance that we have of new products and new technologies?
I think we're at the ideal time. We're just before the products are really going to scale up and become available in a big way. If we start the conversations now and we get, look at the plastics. Look how quickly that rose. When the knowledge was there and the visibility was there and people suddenly seeing the impact, seeing what's going on, look, people have got behind that. I think you could get that same effect by making it understood what the problem is, what the technologies are, what they can do, and that, say, people become familiar with them, and that when it appears, it's no surprise. Generally, people don't like surprise, and they're not real big on change a lot of the time. So you really have to seed the ground, use an agricultural metaphor, seed the ground well and grow the knowledge so that people will accept those products. And if we do that and we start now, by the time we really, really need them, and that's pretty close now, then they will be accepted.
Can you paint two scenarios for me? Can you tell me the most optimistic scenario? What's going to happen over the next, maybe 20 years is a good timescale. What's the best outcome we could hope to see in 20 years, and what is the worst? And could you describe what they look like?
That's interesting. I mean, first of all, I'll preface by saying anyone who tells you they can predict the future is either a fool or a liar.
Mm-hmm. But hey, let's do it anyway.
I'll give you two possibilities. I'm happy to go out there on a limb, Stefan, but I just want to preface it by saying that I am hopefully neither a fool nor a liar. So therefore, what I'm saying is, here's a couple of possible futures. I mean, possible future is, like we were saying about the plastics, we start discussing the technology. It gets on mainstream TV. There is a show on all TV and all channels around the world in developed countries telling people about these new technologies, involving them, getting their feedback, addressing their fears and concerns. We're able to scale up these technologies so that we can manufacture all sorts of different food products and take the load off the planet in terms of the sustainability, in terms of water usage and land usage. Now, how much of conventional animal agriculture in particular continues to exist? It could be animal agriculture as a niche product, or it could be still the dominant product. The jury's still very much out on how that's going to go. But needless to say, we're going to need alternative sources of protein. So 20 years' time, you're going to Waitrose or M&S or places like that, you are going to see a whole different range of products that you never even imagined from going in this morning and seeing what's going on. I've got some pictures of M&S and Waitrose, and I would love to come back to Food Summit, 2029 and 2039 and hobble in 2049 and say, I told you so back then. I was right, So I think it's going to be completely different. And that relies too on legislators get on board, they see the benefits, they understand what's going on, they push the agenda, and again, people are familiar and comfortable with what's going on. We're adequately compensated, people whose livelihoods are being affected, and we have an orderly transition to this new food economy. The other one is conventional agricultural interests manage to stifle technology. VCs go, I've pumped enough money into this, I'm out of here, this is just not going to work, people aren't going to buy it. We then find that what we have is, again, a highly inequitable distribution of food. We're still in the throes of huge obesity. 95.732% of people in the UK and everywhere else are obese. Type 2 diabetes is, insulin manufacturers are making a fortune. That's still going on. And that none of these new technologies actually take enough of a hold to then lift the load on sustainability from the planet. We've got 72,000 Amazon fires at the moment. There's 172,000 every year, and it's almost all gone. So therefore, we're finding it difficult to grow enough food even for ourselves. Climate change has kicked in really high gear. And basically, food starts getting scarce even in places like Australia and the UK and the US. And we suddenly find how vulnerable we are to the global food system, where I think I mentioned before, Alan said this morning, 78% of fruit and veg in the UK is imported. Imagine, with, iceberg lettuce. There's problems in Spain, there's no iceberg lettuce. What if Spain says, I want my iceberg lettuce? You can't have any. What happens when Philippines says, no more pineapples for you? What happens when if this goes on? So, that is more the dystopian type scenario. The reality will probably fall somewhere in the middle, as it usually does. Yeah. But there's two possibles. I'm optimistic that we'll be far more towards that first scenario, where there will be enough vision and enough knowledge, the obvious suspects like Branson and Gates, Bezos and other people who see the future and have got sufficient money to really make a major difference in their own right. And VCs, as venture capital companies, are seeing food as technology. And by seeing food as technology, they're far more comfortable, this is what I believe, in investing in these things because they know they're going to make their 10 times or 20 times back. Not all their investments survive, but the ones that do make them their money. And I think that that's what's happening, that we're seeing these venture capital companies getting far more interest in food, and particularly the very high-tech ones, your synthetic biologies, cell-based, even the algae ones and everything else. They're all high-tech industries, and I think there's a lot of capital flowing into that at the moment. It's been exponential growth in capital in synthetic biology in the last 5 years.
So it looks like a heady complex of investment, politics, legislation, technology, communities and education, really. And I mean, something has to change, I guess, otherwise we're all going to see it very quickly. Tony, thank you so much. Tony Hunter, Food Futurist. Now, where do we find out more about what you do?
Well, you can find me on my website, which is www.futuristforfood.com. And that's my website, so I have a lot of content on there. If people want to have a look, sign up for a newsletter. And of course, the other side of my business, in my consultancy side of the business, is I actually help companies look at this long-term future and how is it going to affect them. Everybody from agtech, from the conventional meat industry, through to companies who are looking at high-tech investments of their own. So, Stefan, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And get back to your next talk.
I will. Thanks a lot. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Table Talk podcast. If you've enjoyed it, please share a review. If you like what you've heard, find out more on foodmatterslive.com or find us on Twitter and Facebook.